about finding consolation in the book of Eikha. I'm going to begin by saying that Echa is most certainly not a book of nechama. It's not a book of consolation. Echa seems to provide very little overt consolation. And in fact, the word nechama appears 6 times in the book of Echa, always in the negative. Well, 5 times in the negative. Ein menachem la, ein li menachem, ki rachok mimeni menachem. And once is a rhetorical question where the answer very clearly is, there is no comforter. Ma anachamech. What can I possibly comfort you with? Echa is not a book which is designed to offer comfort. It's a book of mourning. It's a book of pain. It's a book of grappling with God in a very difficult set of circumstances, a reality which is defined by recent events which are inconceivable, events such as the fall of Yerushalayim, the triumph of evil enemies, the conclusion of the Davidic dynasty and the loss of national autonomy, the loss of the Beit HaMikdash, the loss of the ability to bring korbanot, and the remainder of the inhabitants of Yerushalayim being brought into exile. Echa describes a dismal present, a dismal reality. It offers what seems to be a hopeless portrait of doom. And it seems to feel that it's representing some kind of ending, some kind of tragic conclusion of the nation. We have several psukim that lead us in that rather hopeless direction. Nitanani Hashem bidei lo uchal kum. God has given me into the hands of one before whom I cannot get up. And in fact, in Perek Daled in Megillat Eikha expresses a sense of their fate being worse than the fate of Sodom and Amorah. Vayigdal avon b'nei ami, or vayigdal avon bat ami, mechatot Sodom hahafucha kemo raga, v'lo chalu va yadayim. Right? My situation, my sin, or perhaps my punishment is even worse than that of Sodom, that was overturned in an instant, and hands never touched her, which seems to indicate the hopelessness of the book. If, in fact, we are worse than Sodom, there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope in the book that Am Yisrael will be able to get to its feet again. And yet, Chazal, who are very aware of this problem of hopelessness in the book of Echa, they write a book called Echa Rabbah, which is designed to draw out of Echa some messages of hopefulness. But what do we do with the language of the book itself? What do we do with the book of Echa, which leaves us floundering and feeling quite hopeless? Well, I want to begin by saying that in spite of Echa's rather despondent attitude, and in fact also even her final words, we do have some maybe glimpses of hope in Echa, and even they are followed immediately by this despair. So, for example, at the very end of the book of Echa, when Echa turns to God, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh Yameinu kekedem, and asks God to return us to Him and to renew our days as days of old, that seems to offer us a glimpse of possible revival, of possible hope for the future, but immediately it withdraws back into the dismal present, into the terrible reality of Ki im ma'os me'astanu. Katsafta aleinu ad ma'od. For you have surely rejected us. You have been terribly angry at us. And so even those moments of hopefulness seem to be followed by an immediate sense of despair. And yet, in spite of Echa's rather despondent and defeatist attitude, it seems pretty clear that it's not just that it's clear, it's absolutely incontrovertible that this is not the end. It's not the end of Am Yisrael. It's not the end of Am Yisrael's story, and it's not even the end of Am Yisrael's story in Tanakh. It's not the end of the story of the Jewish people. And I think that if we want to, if we look deeply in Megillat Eikha, we can actually find the hope and the consolation that we're looking for in the language of Megillat Eikha, but not in the language in terms of its meaning, but in the language in terms of the way in which it dialogues with other books in Tanakh. Now, we know that we're not meant to read any one book of Tanakh as a completely autonomous book. We are meant to read the books of Tanakh within their broader context. And once we look at the language of Megillat Eikha as language that references other biblical books, Megillat Eikha seems to take on a bit of a different meaning. We're able to see these passages that are filled with despondency, that are filled with pain and mourning and even hopelessness. But once we see it within its broader context, we see that it was never intended to leave us floundering without hope. In fact, I think that many of Eicha's passages, many of Eicha's terrible descriptions, actually reference other passages that are filled with a promising future. Now, Echa as a book doesn't look much to the future. I think that's the reason that it's particularly filled with despair. It's a book that is noticeably absent of any real petition of God, real requests. There's no moment in the book, for example, that Echa, that Am Yisrael, that Yerushalayim turns to God and says, please rebuild the city, please rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, please God restore us, except for that very last or second to last pasuk, which seems to offer a glimpse of hope. Echa doesn't have much prayer before God, much petition before God to try to reverse the situation. The kinds of requests that are made of God in Megillat Eikha tend to be very, very minimalist, right? So sometimes, or rather in almost every parak, Yerushalayim or the people turn to God and say, Re'eh Hashem v'habita, look God and see me, right? It's a rather minimalist request, right? Just end this period of Hester Panim. And sometimes we have calls upon God to bring vengeance upon the enemy. In fact, we have that at the end of almost every chapter in Megillat Eikha. And as I noted at the very end of the book, we have a glimpse of the future. But generally speaking, Eikha does not point us to the future. But once you see the book within its broader Tanakh context, and you note the language that is dialoguing with other books in Tanakh, I think you begin to see that Eikha does have hope. It does have consolation. And what I want to show you today is Eicha's relationship, or its conversation, its dialogue with three different Tanakh books. And I'm going to do it rather briefly. I'll show you an example or two from each book in order to give you a sense of how I think this is meant to work, how this is meant to reference us to a more positive message than the one that Eikha has. The three books that I want to talk about are Yeshayahu. That's the obvious one because that's the one that Chazal often points to as being in some kind of conversation with Eikha. I'll show you that in a moment. The second book is Zechariah. I think that's obvious as well because that's the one that Rabbi Akiva points us to as offering him hope and optimism and consolation during his terrible experience of Churban. And the third book that I want to reference is the book of Tehillim. And what I want to show you is that it's nearly impossible to feel that there isn't a deliberate attempt to try to compare these two books so that when I'm reading Eikha, I'm meant to be hearing echoes in my head of these other books. I'm meant to be hearing the positive messages of Yeshayahu. Indeed, I'm steeped in mourning as I read the book of Eikha. But at the same time, I'm able to hear those faint echoes of promise that we have in these other books that meet Eikha and that dialogue with the book. So I begin by noting, as I noted just a moment ago, that Eikha Rabbah tries to find hope and consolation in the book of Eikha, and that in this wonderful midrash in Eikha Rabbah, it brings a list of linguistic and thematic connections between the book of Eikha and the book of Yeshayahu, especially those prakim that describe the return of Am Yisrael from Bavel after the terrible Galut. And the midrash says this is God's way of bringing the cure before the punishment by giving Yeshayahu these prophecies that meet Eikha and correct Eikha. So let me read you a couple of them. The midrash in Eikha Rabbah says as follows. Yirmiyahu Amar, and we're going to quote from Eikha, whose author is Yirmiyahu, Darchei Tzion Avelot, the roads of Tzion are mourning. Yeshayahu Amar, Kol Korei Vamidbar, Panu Derech Hashem. Yeshayahu says, no, you have to clear the path of God. We are returning to Yerushalayim on those drachim, on those roads that were bereft of people. Yirmiyahu Amar, Hayutzareha l'rosh. Yirmiyahu said, your enemies were at the head. Yeshayahu amar, v'halchu elecha shchoach b'nei me'anayich. Yeshayahu says, those people who tormented you, they will come bowed before you. Yirmiyahu amar, vayetze mibat Zion kol hadara. Yirmiyahu says, all the glory of Zion left her. V'Yeshayahu amar, uvalet Zion goel. Yeshayahu says, no, the Redeemer is going to come back to Zion. I could go on and on. Perhaps I'll skip ahead and mention the last one. It's not the last one in the Midrash, but I'll mention one last one. Yirmiyahu amar, persa Zion biyadeha, ein menachem la. Yirmiyahu says, Zion stretched out her hands, and there was no one to comfort her. Yeshayahu amar, anochi, anochi, hu menachemchem. That God presents himself, I am your comforter. Right? So we see that this Midrash is well aware that Yeshayahu and Echa are in conversation. This Midrash is actually built on an alphabetic structure. Right? So it brings each pasuk represents a different letter in the alphabet. And what this Midrash seems to be saying is that even when we finish reading Echa and we feel that we have little to no hope, we are meant to hear the echoes of Yeshayahu. It becomes clear that Echa's dismal situation is not meant to leave us in this predicament where we have no possibility of revival, but rather there is a cure that is built into the very fabric of Tanakh. Now, in light of this promising Midrash, I want to show a few what I think are remarkable passages, particularly in Yeshayahu, which hint at the fact that Echa is not the end of the story. And in order to do this, I want to begin in Echa Perek Bet. Echa Perek Bet is a very, very difficult chapter in Echa, and it really describes a fallen city. And that's the first part of the Perek, a city that has been hurled to the ground by God, right? That's the very first pasuk. Echa ya'iv be'apo Hashem et bat Zion. How God has clouded over in his anger the daughter of Zion. He shlich mishamayim eretz tiferet Israel. He flung the glory of Israel from the heavens to the earth. One of the key words in this chapter is the word eretz, a city that has fallen. Everything has come crashing to the ground. Her fortresses, her buildings, her Beit HaMikdash, and of course, her people. And when we get to the middle of the parak, which is the conclusion of the description of the destruction of the city, we find the Ziknei Bat Zion, the elders of Zion, He'elu Afar Al Rosham. They are putting dust on their heads. Yeshvu La'aretz. They are sitting on the ground. This is a pasuk that is filled with mourning. The glorious leaders of Yerushalayim are wearing sackcloth. They are sitting in the dust. They are putting dust on their heads. And when we go a few psukim, when we continue a few psukim from here, what we see is a description of Yerushalayim's inability to obtain any comfort. Ma ashvelach va'anachamech. What can I compare you to so that I can console you, Betulat Bat Zion? Ki gadol kayam shivrech mi yirpalach. For as great as the sea is your brokenness, who can cure you? The sea becomes a symbol for the irreparable brokenness of the city. It hints to the fact that she is shedding copious tears. It hints to the violent and churning turmoil of the city, who are being tossed from place to place as if they're in the waves of the great sea. It hints to the vast and unbridgeable despair of a city that has no comfort. Now from here I want to turn to a wonderful passage in Yeshayahu. We won't read the whole passage together for lack of time, but I refer you to read the entire passage. It is, of course, one of the prophecies of consolation that we read after we experience Tisha B'Av. So that's also part of the awareness that there is some kind of conversation going on between Yeshayahu and Echa. And the passage that I'm going to read from, I'm going to start in Perek Nun Aleph, Pasuk Yud Bet. Anochi, Anochi, hu menachemchem. Right, we saw that before. Ma ashvelach va'anachamech, asks Echa, what can I compare you to so that I can console you? And God says, I am your consoler. Skip ahead to Perek Nun Aleph, Pasuk Tetvav, and look at how God introduces himself. Ve'anochi Hashem Elokecha, roga hayam, vayehemu galav, Hashem tzvaot shemo. And I am God your God. I am the one who calms the sea, and I can churn up the waves. Hashem tzvaot shemo, right? This is the God who can take that experience that we experienced in Echa, ki gadol kayam shivrech, that your brokenness is as great as the sea, and he can calm that brokenness. And as we move ahead in this parak in Yeshayahu, at the beginning of parak Nun Bet, Yeshayahu speaks to Yerushalayim and says to Yerushalayim what I think is going to be a rather familiar passage: Uri, Uri, awaken, awaken, livshi uzech Tzion, dress yourself in glory, Tzion, livshi bigdei tifartech Yerushalayim, dress yourself in clothes of glory, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. I'm skipping a little bit. Hitna'ari, shake yourself off, me'afar, Kumi, Shivi Yerushalayim, right? Shake off the dust. Of course, that's very familiar from Lecha Dodi, right? We have here this description of Yeshayahu saying to the people of Yerushalayim, saying to Yerushalayim herself, get up from the ground, shake off the dust. It is time to restore your former glory. And I see that, I hear in that echoes of Echa Perek Bet, which leaves us fallen in despair on the streets of the city, rolling in dust. And here Yeshayahu says, you will not remain in dust. Get up and reassume your former glory. So that's, I think, one wonderful example. I'm going to show you another one, which I think is really a very strong example, and it relates to the other, I think, very difficult parak in Echa. I mean, Echa has a lot of difficult prakim, but prakim Bet and Daled, and Echa only has 5 prakim, but prakim Bet and Daled are the really most difficult prakim in Echa. They have very heartrending descriptions, particularly of the children and of the starvation in the city. Well, at the end of the description of the destruction of Yerushalayim in Echa Perek Daled, in Pasuk Yud Daled, we have this final description of the people leaving the city. And this is how they are described. Na'u ivrim bachutzot, blind people are wandering on the streets. Nigo'alu badam, they have become sullied by blood. Bilo yuchlu yig'u bilvushehem, no one can touch their clothes. Suru tamei karulamo, go away, impure one, they called to them. We don't know who's calling to whom here. Suru, suru, al tigau, go away, don't touch. Ki natsu gam na'u, amru bagoyim, lo yosifu lagor. When they wandered, I'm going to take liberties here with the translation. When they wandered among the nations said, you can't continue to live here. This is an, I think, very powerful description of the way in which the nations often treated Am Yisrael during those years of exile, how many countries expelled Am Yisrael from their country. And here, what Megillat Eikha seems to be describing is this sense in the world that Am Yisrael, wherever they go, they bring with them the impurities of the destruction of their holy city. It's a terrible description, one that I think is also very prescient. In other words, it really does seem to describe the history of Am Yisrael during the many years of exile. I'm not talking about the first exile now. I'm certainly talking about the second exile, right? The exile after the destruction of the second Beit Mikdash. But what I want you to see now is this passage in Yeshayahu Nun Bet. It's actually the continuation of the same haftarah that we were reading before. It's the conclusion of that haftarah. It's the haftarah actually for Parshat Shoftim. And if you look in Nun Bet Yud Aleph, Well, let's start before that, okay? If you look in Nun Bet Zayin, we have Manavu al Harim, Raglei Mivaser. How wonderful are the legs of the messenger in the mountains. Mashmi'a Shalom, Mivaser Tov. Mashmi'a Yeshua. He is coming with a message of salvation. Omer L'Tzion, Malach Elohayich. He tells Tzion, your God is reigning again, right? And we have this really, I think this is one of the most wonderful passages in the Tanakh. I can't read the whole thing, right? We have Ki ayin ba'ayin yir'u b'shuv Hashem tzion, right? We have that. You will see this panim el panim kind of experience, right? God is no longer hiding his face from us. And we have chasaf Hashem et zra kodsho. God reveals his arm le'enei kol hagoyim v'ra'u kol afsei aretz et yeshuat Eloheinu. Everybody sees God's salvations. And now, listen to this passage. Perek Nun Bet, Pasuk Yud Aleph. Suru, suru, tze'u misha. It's the prophet speaking to the people in Galut. Turn aside. Go out from there. Tamei al tiga'u. Don't touch anything impure. Tze'u mitocha. Go out of the Galut. Hibaru nosei klei Hashem. Purify yourselves, you who hold the vessels of God. It's the opposite description of what we had in Echa. In Echa, the people leave Yerushalayim bloodied, sullied, bringing with them the impurity of their sins, the impurity of these terrible, catastrophic events. And the prophecy of Yeshayahu responds to that description and tells the people of exile that they are in the impure place, that if they want to achieve purity, they should leave the exile. They should go back to the land of Israel as the bearers of God's sanctity, of God's vessels, of God's holy vessels. Right? This prophecy of Yeshayahu seems to be really responding to that terrible description in Echa, and in that context, Yeshayahu seems to provide comfort for Echa's hopeless situation. There's a lot more to say about Yeshayahu, but I want to turn our attention to two more books, and we'll do it rather briefly. The first one is Zechariah, who lives, of course, during the time of Shivat Zion, and also seems to consciously reverse the catastrophe of Echa. One of the most excruciating sights in Echa is the image of the children who are dying on the streets of the city. We maybe alluded to it before, particularly in Echa Perek Bet. We have it again in Perek Daled, where we have the children languishing on the streets of the city. Be'atef olel v'yonek birchovot kirya. They are languishing, they are fainting on the streets of the city. And when we continue in this Perek, we actually see another excruciating sight. It kind of widens our image in Pasuk Kaf Aleph, where we're told, Shachvu la'aretz chutzot, na'ar v'zakein, who is lying on the streets of the city, the elderly, whose undignified public death is accompanied by the tragic spectacle of the untimely death of the youth. And so we have the young and the old expiring on the streets of the city. Now we look back at this, I think, one of the most extraordinary nivuot, certainly in Sefer Zechariah. It was a nivuah that Rav Amital, the Rosh Yeshiva, Zichrono Tzadik Livracha, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Hakotel, who survived the Holocaust only to come to the state of Israel in order to fight here in the War of Independence and eventually to set up Yeshivat Hakotel. And this was, I believe, his most frequently cited pasuk. Zechariah says, Ko amar Hashem tzavaot, od yeshvu zekenim uzkenot birchovot Yerushalayim, v'ish mish'anto biado merov yamim, urchovot ha'ir yimala'u yiladim v'iladot mesachakim birchovoteha. Once again, we have an image of the streets of Yerushalayim. But in this image, we have elderly people walking with their staff so they can lean upon it. That is how elderly they are. And the streets of the city are filled with children's laughter, filled with children playing. Baruch Hashem, Zachinu. We've seen these images today as well. But what I want you to note is that this is the reversal of Echa. And this may be the reason why Rabbi Akiva, in that very well-known Agadah, where he sees the foxes traversing the ruins of Har Habayit, he laughs. And when his friends ask him why he laughs, he cites this pasuk. He says he believes that that situation will be reversed. I'll bring one final example, and it's an example from Mizmor Tehillim that I think is also deeply, deeply resonant in our days. But I'll first start with this pasuk in Echa Perek Hey. At the conclusion of Echa, we have this rather brief, hopeful, somewhat rumination. It's the book concludes with this thought, or it's one of the final psukim in the book. Ata Hashem leolam teshev, kisacha ledor vador. You, God, are eternal. You sit in judgment eternally. This basically ends the book. It's a couple of psukim before the end of the book with a small modicum of hope. We don't exactly know what he's trying to say, but he says, you, God, are eternal. And presumably what he's implying is, or what he says afterwards, Lama netzach tishkachenu. Why would you forget us forever? Ta'azvenu lorech yamin. Why would you forsake us forever? It's a rhetorical question. You're forever, and eventually, I am certain, that's what it implies, that you will forgive us. There's one other place where a very similar pasuk appears. V'ata Hashem leolam teshev kisacha ledor vador. And it's in a very resonant Mizmor Tehillim, resonant for our times, right? Really something that I think really seems to encapsulate some of the remarkable events that have happened in Am Yisrael's history in the past 100 years. And, when you look at this Mizmor Tehillim, and it's Mizmor Kuf Bet, right? This Mizmor begins with terrible disaster, terrible calamity, this sense of loneliness, right? He's boded al gag. That word boded also reminds us of Echa. He's sitting all lonely, and the loneliness emanates from the terrible torments that he's been through. So he says, for example, if you look in Pasuk Daled, Ki chalu ve'ashan yamai. My days went up in smoke. Ve'atzmotai kimoked nicharu. And my bones were burned like in a pier. So that sounds like things that we have unfortunately seen. And he goes on and he says in Pasuk Hey, Ukacha esev vayivash libi. I forgot to eat food, right? Because of my terrible groans, because of my terrible pain. And then he goes on and he says, Kol hayom cherfuni oivai. All day my enemies mock me. Ki efer kalechem achalti. V'shikuvai bivchi masachti. Right? I'm drinking my own tears. Right? This is the description of a terrible calamity. And suddenly, in Pasuk Yud Gimel, he turns to God with the following statement: V'ata Hashem leolam teshev v'zichrecha ledor vador. That's exactly our statement, almost exactly, right? You, God, are forever. Your eternity is unquestionable. And then he turns to God with a bold request, one that doesn't appear in Megillat Eikha. Ata takum Tirachem Tzion, ki eit lechenena ki va moed. You, God, get up. You will have compassion on Tzion. The time has come. Ki ratzu avadecha et avaneha et afara yechonenu, v'yir'u goyim et shem Hashem, v'chol malchei haaretz et kvodecha. Right? Everyone will see the name of God. Ki vana Hashem Tzion nir'a bichvodo. The Mizmor goes on. But what I want to point out here is that this Mizmor shows diametrically opposed situations. First, we have the misery of a catastrophic situation. And then we have suddenly joy and triumph and spreading God's name in the world and God rebuilding Tzion and bringing the people back to Tzion. Right? And all of this is marked by one very interesting transition pasuk. And that pasuk is, ואתה השם לעולם תשב, וזכרך לדור ודור. I think that this gives us a different understanding of the end of Echa. Echa kind of trails off into some kind of modicum of hope, but it ends with a sigh, right? I mentioned it before. Ki ma'os me'astanu, katsafta aleinu ad me'od. You've rejected us. And yet, what echoes in our head is that pasuk. Ve'ata Hashem le'olam teshev, kisacha le'dor v'dor. You, God, are eternal. ... This verse, this pasuk, situated at the end of Echa, suggests that we are on the cusp of the same turnaround. Once God sits in judgment again, he will surely remember his people to save them. And that is a remarkable message of consolation. So that when we see Megillat Eikha juxtaposed next to Tehillim Kuf Bet, when we see Megillat Eikha in its broader context, we begin to see Megillat Eikha in a new light. The book itself may record a kind of a situation of despair, of hopelessness, but it most certainly does not leave us hanging without any messages of hope. All of the Tanakh is one seamless whole, and we are meant to read it as one book. And in that context, Echa is not the end of the story. I'd like to conclude this shiur by returning briefly to Tehillim Kuf Bet, and by once again observing how relevant that mizmor is in our past century, where we witnessed the terrible suffering of the Holocaust, and almost immediately afterwards, in a stunning turnaround, the revival of the state of Israel, of the nation of Israel, the ability to move past the suffering of the Holocaust to a post-Echa world in which Shama Hashem and Kat Asir, God heard the groans of the prisoners. Bana Hashem et Zion, God rebuilt Zion. And I would like to conclude with a tefillah that we should merit, in light of this mizmor, we should merit l'saper Shem Hashem b'Tzion v'tilato b'Yerushalayim. We should merit to use that turnaround to tell of God's name in Zion, to tell of his glory in Yerushalayim, and that these events should lead the world v'yir'u goyim et Shem Hashem v'chol malchei haaretz et kvodecha u'mamlachot la'avod et Hashem.
Yirachem, Yirachem.